A new piece in The Atlantic is taking a critical look at former Vice President Mike Pence's presidential campaign. Specifically, author Jonathan V. Last asked the question, why does he think the people who wanted to kill him will vote for him? And he writes in part, quote, if Mike Pence were to walk through the crowd at a Donald Trump rally, for instance, the recent giant event where 50,000 Trump supporters swamped the town of Pickens, South Carolina, he would need a security detail. He would not be safe without one, and he might not be safe with one either. In fact, I have a hard time believing that any Secret Service team would agree to go along with such an excursion. Enough Trump supporters hate Pence that much. Remember, of course, January 6th, they wanted to hang him. It turns out that Pence doesn't quite know what to do with himself either. So he's trying his luck at becoming the avatar of the same voters who wanted to hang him. Joining us now, the author of that piece and editor of The Bulwark, Jonathan V. Last. And Jonathan Lemire has the first question as the author of The Big Lie. Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan, great to see you. There was a clip that went viral over the weekend. Mike Pence was at the Iowa State Fair, and a guy came up to him, a Trump supporter, and said, well, I guess I'm glad we didn't hang you, which is trying to be darkly funny, but underscores just the situation that he's in and the struggle that he has trying to win over some of those voters. It does seem that in the last week or so, he's found his voice a little bit stronger, condemning what Trump did, the latest out of Georgia. But he's in a really impossible dynamic. How would you chart his course forward if you could?
Well, you know, I mean, my buddy Chris Cillizza, you guys all know him. He wrote a piece this week suggesting that the reason Pence is running isn't because he thinks he can win, but because he's trying to sort of validate his place in history, because he thinks, I think not unreasonably, that when the Trump moment is finally over, Pence will actually, in a weird way, his actions on January 6th will come to, you know, paint him as one of the great heroes. I kind of agree with that. But I'd ask you this, Jonathan, in all seriousness, if Mike Pence were running in the Democratic primary against Joe Biden, do you think he would be polling more or less than the 2% he's got right now in the Republican average? Because I honestly think he'd be polling like a point or two higher in the Democratic primary than he is in the Republican primary.
Yeah, I mean, he might be. I mean, he's certainly there. At the very least, there would be Democrats who just believe in the Constitution and the rule of law, who would be grateful for his performance that day. That Pence, of course, was so loyal to Trump right until the very end. So let's have a hypothetical. Let's say Donald Trump does show up on the debate Wednesday night next week, and Mike Pence has a chance to stand across the stage from his former running mate. What would Pence say to Trump in that moment with the eyes of the nation on him?
Yeah, I think he would look at Trump and say some version of, you know, we were great partners for 4 years, Mr. President, and I have all the respect in the world for you. But what you did on that day was so out of character and so dangerous, and we really can't do that again. And this is, look, those of us who watched the last 7 years would say, oh, come on. It's not like the January 6th Donald Trump was some, Mr. Hyde after the Dr. Jekyll of like good Trump. That's ridiculous. But at least Pence is willing to go that far, right? And the rest of the Republican field, with the very honorable exceptions of Asa Hutchinson and Chris Christie, and sometimes Will Hurd, it depends on which day of the week it is for Will Hurd. The rest of them aren't willing to do it. This is the weird thing. You're going to have this debate next Wednesday. Trump won't be there. And most of the Republicans on that stage are going to be making his defenses for him in absentia. And this is, you guys were just talking about how is it possible that Donald Trump is winning with all this? I mean, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, it's much more important for these people to control the Republican Party than it is to control political power. That's they need to own the house they live in. But secondly, you look at them, their voters go to the crosstabs on these polls. Their own voters are so wildly out of sync with the rest of the country that it's very, very hard for them to stand up there and say, no, actually, these things are really serious. You should, the dude broke the law 91 times.
Jonathan, Al Sharpton, following up on the point you made earlier, is some of the motivation of Mike Pence, since you say he's not going to win and he probably knows he's not going to win the nomination, is some of it that he sees this disaster coming with these 4 cases and what it will do to not only Donald Trump and some of his co-defendants, but the party. And he's trying to distance himself in history from I was not part of that cabal, and I, in fact, tried to stand up. Is he trying to redeem himself that he doesn't go out with the debris that is inevitably going to happen after these trials?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is the tragedy of Mike Pence. Think about this, Reverend, right? So he was brought onto the ticket to seal the deal with Christian evangelical voters who were still slightly skeptical of Trump. And we fast forward to 6 years later, and with all of with everything we saw about Trump, now when evangelical voters are given the choice between Mike Pence, who everybody says is, like whatever you want to say about him, like is an actual God-fearing Christian, and Donald Trump, who is Donald Trump, the 91 indictments, evangelical voters, and you saw this at like the Faith Forum in Iowa a few weeks ago with Tucker, and has to choose between Trump and Pence. They go, give us Barabbas. It's the craziest damn thing. And I think Pence is really trying to salvage himself from that.